What we want to do today is to introduce to you the argument of our book, The Cost of Connection, in the context of what we see as a wider decolonial turn in thinking about data and technology, which has really developed over the past 10 years and which goes much beyond our own book. So let's just start with 3 quotations that are quite interesting because I think they give you a sense of the scale and the breadth of the data capture that is going on all around us in the world today. The first quote comes from a famous essay by Google's chief economist, Hal Varian, an essay called Beyond Big Data, where he wrote as an economist that there is now a computer in the middle of virtually every transaction. And he wrote this in an essay where he said, the big thing is not the internet as such. It's not social media. It's this fundamental economic and social fact that every time we transact, there is a computer in the middle of that transaction. What's the consequence of this, he argued? It's because transactions are now computer mediated that we, and he meant Google, can observe behavior that was previously not observable. And even more important, we can write contracts on it. In other words, we can make money out of observing behavior. He wrote that in 2013. And in a 2019 essay, he wrote of what he called the data pipeline, which, because it's oil that passes down pipelines, it makes the link to some of the assets of historical colonialism even clearer than it was in that first quotation. That's the first quotation. The second quotation comes from an important piece of journalism by the American Wall Street Journal, from an important report they did about data extraction in the health sector that was prompted by Google buying Fitbit, the device for measuring your health, your running and your breathing and your blood and so on. Google bought Fitbit for $2 billion in November 19. And in the course of that article, the Wall Street Journal say, health services remains an open frontier. This idea of a frontier for exploration, again, is almost colonial. The third quotation we want to start with comes from a really important article about the role of data in agriculture, the rise of so-called ag tech, which is changing how farmers plant their seeds across the world, the farm machinery they use, all of which are now computers, taking data, sending it back to the company that made the technology. And Alistair Fraser, in that piece about precision agriculture, sums up the transformation by saying the land grab yields a data grab. In other words, you can't separate power in agriculture, which depends on using the land, from the new grab of data through the machinery that is used to make agriculture happen. So those are 3 areas: general economics, health, and agriculture, important to all of our lives, that are fundamentally being transformed by data. So the question that we pose in our book responds to all these developments. And the question is basically very simple. The question is, what is going on with data? How should we understand? How should we frame the countless new and not so new things going on with data in business, in government, in society, and in our daily lives? And these are developments for sure that have been accelerated by the change in our living conditions across the world through the global pandemic, including what we're doing right now, listening and talking to each other across Zoom, a platform which collects data from this transaction. So what is going on with data? Well, there have been many ideas put on the table for what's going on with data, and almost all of them explain it as a new form of capitalism. So we have the idea of a digital capitalism from Dan Schiller, or informational capitalism from Manuel Castells and then Julie Cohen, or more precisely, the idea of platform capitalism from Nick Couldry. Most famously, we have the idea from Shoshana Zuboff of Harvard of a surveillance capitalism. And then finally, most literally, we have the idea of a data capitalism. These are all important ideas. We agree with a lot of them. We've learned a lot from them. But in our book, we wanted to ask a different question, which is whether something potentially even larger is going on with data. Something that truly momentous in history, that would be a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. We'll explain what this might be in a moment, but we get a hint that there might be something colonial going on with data from some of the business cliches of the past 5 years. For example, this famous cover of the Economist magazine from May 2017, which said in a famous phrase in their editorial that data is the new oil. Of course, oil is classically one of the assets derived from historical colonialism. So the question is this just a harmless metaphor? Or is it exactly a phrase that covers up, that disguises a genuinely new reality that needs to be disguised because it amounts to a new colonialism? The possibility of framing in a critical colonial perspective what's going on with data emerged also in popular discourse in the Cambridge Analytica scandal 3 years ago. I'm sure you remember some of that. So Cambridge Analytica was a small company based in Cambridge that used Facebook-generated data to create psychological profiles of hundreds of thousands of Facebook users, and then use that data to target those people with political propaganda. The insider who broke that scandal, Christopher Wiley, a few weeks after it broke, was asked about Cambridge Analytica's plans also to influence politics in India. And here's what he said on Twitter. Well, this is what modern colonialism looks like. But the question is, what could that actually mean?
So a central point in our argument is that this is not exactly a metaphor. The way we're using the word colonialism is very intentional. We're not suggesting that what we're seeing looks like colonialism or is colonialism in an allegorical way. We are, in fact, suggesting that what we're seeing is a new phase of colonialism, an emerging reality that we call data colonialism. We are essentially talking about this new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. And this emerging phase, we argue, is preparing the ground for a new mode of capitalist production. Just like if you think about it, colonialism prepared the ground for industrial capitalism. And this is something when I talk to my students, they usually think of colonialism and capitalism as discrete, separate areas. But we should remember that, in fact, for instance, the plantations of colonialism financed the factories. Without the wealth generated in colonialism, in other words, we wouldn't have the momentum that made industrial capitalism possible. So we have this progression going on, but also this is happening while coexisting with the neo-colonial legacy. Data colonialism exists at a time when the inequalities created during colonialism continue very much to be with us. We are, of course, talking about the legacy of underdevelopment, of racism, of violence. So that is still very much with us. Now, we also argue that what we're seeing is a potentially global transformation that plays out in both the global north and the global south. And this is important because other similar concepts that talk about these dynamics sometimes fail to account for the global scope of data colonialism. So, for instance, Martineau's concept of techno-colonialism, which sounds similar to what we're talking about, suggests that only the South is the victim. It's a case of the North oppressing the South, while ignoring that actually there are oppressed populations in the North as well. Likewise, Michael Quet's concept of digital colonialism, which again sounds very similar to our concept, focuses only on big tech from Silicon Valley as the perpetrators, perhaps ignoring a little bit what's happening in China or in other parts of the world. So both approaches that I just mentioned fail to capture the full scope of this emerging reality. Now, if this is indeed a global phenomenon that we're seeing, are we suggesting that we can expect to see the same level of physical violence that we saw during historical colonialism replicated in data colonialism at a global level? And we're saying no. We're not making a one-to-one comparison here, and that's important. But we are saying that the impact of the social change is comparable. We're talking about basically different means, but very similar ends. Now, at this point, let me go ahead and give you the definition of data colonialism, as Nick and I frame it. So we say that data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. So a couple of important points about this definition. We're not saying all data is bad. We're not saying we must reject all data. We're specifically concerned about the continuous extraction of data from our social lives. And we are concerned with this process when it is used specifically for the generation of profit. Now, in order to also unpack this definition, we need to understand the difference between colonialism and coloniality. This is a term that was developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. And just to summarize, obviously a very complex argument, his point was essentially that, okay, let's assume colonialism is over. There are no more colonies. And of course, some people might disagree even with that statement. If we ask people in Puerto Rico or Palestine, they might argue that colonialism and colonies are still very much with us. But by and large, colonialism is over. Quijano's point was that coloniality implies that the legacy of colonialism is still very much with us. It continues to shape power relations, differences in wealth, for instance, between nations. It continues to shape race relations, of course, relations between white people and people of color, and even the way we construct knowledge. All of these things are still very much impacted by the legacy of colonialism, even if it's over. That's what he meant by coloniality. So we're saying, in essence, that there are differences between historic colonialism and data colonialism. Like I said earlier, we're not making a one-to-one comparison. Historic colonialism had different modes, different intensities, different scales, and context than data colonialism. It looked very different. But we are saying that there is one clear similarity, and that is the historical function of colonialism, of both colonialisms, is the same. And that function is to dispossess, to extract. The old colonialism grabbed land, resources. The new colonialism grabs us, our social lives, through this medium of data. So how is all of this being rationalized? One of the reasons this new emerging order is very efficient is because the ways of justifying it resonate very much with old ways of justifying or rationalizing colonialism. So the new rationalities are based on old rationalities, whether these are economic or legal or technological rationalities. If we think about it, they have a deep colonial past. Let's start with the narrative of cheap nature. To colonize the world, the colonizers had to frame nature as cheap. Nature was supposed to be abundant. It was supposed to be free, just there for the taking. From a legal perspective, this land didn't even have an owner, at least a civilized owner, right? That's why we have the concept of terra nullius, which means no man's land. White Europeans arrived in all parts of the world and said, this land is empty, we can appropriate it, even if it's occupied by other human beings. From cheap nature, we move to cheap labor. In colonialism, some humans, and as you know, this was mostly determined by race, by the color of their skin, they were meant or predestined to supply the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So in this way, as we know very well, exploitation or abuse were framed as social progress, as something that was good for humanity. So if we follow this progression from cheap nature to cheap labor, we now end up with cheap data. And if you think about it, cheap data shares many of the same characteristics of cheap nature and cheap labor that we just described. Again, it is supposed to be abundant. Again, it's supposed to be free, just there for the taking, without an owner. You and I may produce it and own it individually, but by the time it gets aggregated, it no longer has individual owners, and it must be aggregated because in that form, it can be processed by applying technological processes that we individually don't have. So this is where the corporations come in with advanced technology, and like oil, they need to refine this resource. They need to process it so that it becomes something valuable. We are told that our only job is to generate it. And we are told that this is what the new kind of progress looks like, what the new kind of benefit for humanity looks like. But what exactly do we gain by looking at things this way?
Well, we realize that it may be unsettling to compare what's going on with data, not just in the global south, but also in the global north, to colonialism. So let's try and summarize what we see as the advantages of this decolonial frame for thinking about data. And the advantages are of two types: advantages of scope and advantages of depth. So let's start with scope. So a colonial approach to what's going on with data means understanding it in terms not just of the past 4 decades when the internet emerged, but the past 500 years. And it also means looking further into the future and thinking about what's going on with data today, the extraction of data in new forms, as a new historically significant form of resource extraction that is today building the foundations of the next stage of capitalism, just as historical colonialism built the foundations for the capitalism that was to come 2 centuries later. A colonial approach to data also widens our sense of the scope of what's going on with data. So, of course, it is partly about social media platforms such as Facebook, but it's not just about the extraction of data there. It's about the spread of surveillance of workers of all sorts, but particularly workers who are paid less and have lower status. Data colonialism is also about the emergence of the gig economy, platforms such as Uber and Didi and Airbnb over the past decade or so, which have created a new economic form for extracting economic value through the control of data across digital platforms. Data colonialism is also about the rise of logistics in all forms of business. This has been going on for 30 or 40 years. And of course, it means that the goods that we want to buy move around space more efficiently, which sounds good. Everyone wants their Amazon package to arrive on time. But the logistics, the surveillance of goods, also means the surveillance of the human beings who are moving the goods. So this intensifies the surveillance of labor in the economy. And finally, data colonialism also involves something that almost no one talks about, which is the rise, the massive expansion of internal corporate data. That is data that is gathered inside corporations. We don't normally think about IBM as one of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley. But IBM, in its 2016 annual report, said that it didn't care about that. It didn't have social media platforms. It didn't care because in IBM's view, 80% of the world's most valuable data is inside corporations. Now, you might say, well, what does it mean to be inside a corporation? Maybe I don't care about that. Just imagine, though, you just bought a smart fridge in your home, which would mean that every time you put milk into the fridge, every time you take milk out, it will be recorded by the fridge. Maybe when you're running out of milk, the fridge will deliver, the corporation will, the smart fridge will ensure that you buy automatically another bottle of milk. This means that data about your usage of milk, which you would have thought was just a private matter, just part of your private life, has now become data that is internal to the corporation supplying the smart fridge. So this question of internal corporate data is itself transforming and extremely important. So those are the advantages of scope and scale. But the other type of advantage from a colonial perspective is an advantage of depth. A colonial approach deepens our sense of what is being achieved through the extraction of data, which is, in our view, a new social order, a new economic order, just as it was with historical colonialism. This new order involves new forms of dependency. We depend on platforms to be there for us so that we can run our social lives. Also, new forms of rule. We are governed by platforms. We have to follow their instructions. All of this is based on things which are offered to us, which seem nice, like convenience, customization, or as the marketers call it, personalization. But also new forms of force, because as we've said before, this new order reinforces older inequalities which come from earlier colonialism and capitalism, inequalities of class, gender, and race. And then finally, another advantage of depth of the colonial perspective on data is that it enables us to see something that we would never see in another perspective, which is that the rhetoric around big data, around big tech, the extraction of data at all possible times is in fact a continuation of colonial surveillance of populations, for sure, but also of something even deeper, which is the attempt by the West throughout modernity for at least 500 years to impose on the whole world one single vision of what is rational, an idea of Western science as automatically superior and therefore justifying the grabbing of the resources of the rest of the world. All of this is unfolding within the deep colonial underpinning of capitalism itself, which many people term as racial capitalism, as Gargi Bhattacharya does. But in her book on racial capitalism, she also rightly emphasizes that racial capitalism started with the land grab of historical colonialism. Without that, it could never have got started. So those are the overall advantages of this colonial perspective on data. We just now want to bring out a little bit more some of the connections back to earlier social theory that will help put our own theory of data colonialism in some context. And here I personally will be making some links to the talk that I gave in Seoul 3 years ago at the Seoul National University when I was talking about a different book, The Mediated Construction of Reality with Andreas Hepp. First of all, then, I want to say a little bit more about the concept of social order, which I just mentioned. So the idea of data colonialism is about a new social order being built. That means we're saying much more than that there are some bad things being done by a few particular platforms. We're talking about the reorganization of every aspect of social and economic life on a massive scale that involves all of us too. We're part of this order. If we were not part of the order, it would not be an order. Order involves everyone. But this new order can only be understood through, as I said, the new forms of dependencies, new types of relations we have with each other and with platforms and with data. And this approach to what social order is, not just based on physical force, brute power, but as a change in social relations across the whole of society, comes from a particular idea of earlier social theory, which was Norbert Elias's work, the great German social theorist and historical sociologist, who theorized social order as a form of figuration, a reconfiguring of society through new types of relation. And we think this is a much richer and more complicated account of how societies hold together, and so therefore how societies can hold together in new ways when massive social change happens. It's a much richer account than the one offered, for example, by Shoshana Zuboff in her book on surveillance capitalism, where she says quite explicitly, surveillance capitalism is an order imposed from above through force. We have no choice. We can't consent with it. It's just something done to us. So that's the first social theoretical point about our approach, which is different from Shoshana Zuboff's thinking, but also links to my own previous work with Andreas Hepp in The Mediated Construction of Reality. Another social theory point we want to say a little bit more about says a little bit more about this difficult but crucial concept of coloniality that Ulises already introduced. This is about the key connections between colonialism and knowledge. This is an insight that actually has been around for a long time, but it's a difficult insight. It's a painful thing to think about, so it's often forgotten. It's there in Quijano's crucial work about the control of knowledge by the West through modernity as the basis of the violence of colonialism. But the same insight is there in a writer who actually celebrated colonialism, the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt, a very controversial figure, but also a very clear thinker who, in his book after the Second World War, The Nomos of the Earth, looked back on the failure of the German Nazi regime with great regret, and he lamented the end of historical colonialism. But he also offered a very clear description of how colonialism worked. And this is what Carl Schmitt said in 1950, that European discovery of the New World in the 15th and 16th centuries did not occur by chance. It was the achievement of newly awakened Occidental Western rationalism. The Indians, by contrast, lacked the scientific power of Christian European rationality. And then this is the key point. The intellectual advantage was entirely on the European side, so much so that the New World could simply be taken. It's an extraordinary thing to say. He's saying that because the West was more rational, which is very controversial, of course, it's because of that that it was right for the West to take everything. We think this is the core of the idea of big data. It's because Google, Amazon have the world's best AI, they believe, that they are entitled to take data from our lives. So those are some links to social theory. Let's move on and think a little bit more about how data colonialism works practically. We've said that data colonialism is part of the ongoing relations between colonialism and capitalism. And that means that to understand it, we must look not just at decolonial theory, we also have to look at critical theories of capitalism. And above all, that means looking at the work of Karl Marx. That is Karl Marx, the social theorist, not Karl Marx, the economist. As you probably know, for Marx and for orthodox Marxism, the social structures of capitalism are reproduced through labor relations, through how we sell our work for money on a labor market. That's important, of course, within the world of data colonialism. There's no doubt that work is increasingly being datafied, as I just said. But we would argue that this emerging social order of data colonialism just cannot be understood in its whole by only thinking about labor relations. Why is that? Well, actually, we all know the reason why. Just think of what happens when at the end of a week, when you've been working really hard, you're exhausted, you don't want to work anymore. You just want to eat with your friends or your family, send some nice pictures of what you're eating, you're having fun. That's when you know you are not working. That's obvious. You are not working at last. But at the very same time, you also know you are still part of the social order of data colonialism, because data, or at least metadata, will be being extracted from your phone to benefit corporations. So you have not escaped the order of data colonialism, even though you are definitely not working. So to understand data colonialism, we need to theorize a new type of social relation, which reproduces it. And this is what in our book we call data relations. Data relations are ways of reproducing social life, ways of reconfiguring all our social interactions for one goal, which benefits corporations. And the goal is to optimize data extraction for profit. Now, how can we make this theory and be consistent with Marx? Here we benefit from the brilliant work of critical Marxist theorist Moishe Postone, who died 2 or 3 years ago. Postone argued that we needed to update Marxist theory for a period 130 years after Marx wrote, which means that we need to rethink what is the fundamental reproducing mechanism of capitalism. And Postone argued that that mechanism is not, it's not labor relations. It's not even the commodification of labor that makes possible a labor market. It's something that makes commodification possible, which is abstraction. It's the idea that out of the messy flow of our lives, the disorganized stuff we do, that something can be extracted and defined, a unit which can be sold on a market for money. That's abstraction. And when you think about it, abstraction is exactly what the making of data is. It is the making of an economic unit out of the messy flow of how I'm feeling today and how my friends are feeling today. The result of this is that ordinary social life, everything we do all the time, is able to become a direct factor, as Marx put it, a factor of capitalist production, an input to capitalist production, just like the seeds and the manure, as Marx put it, in agriculture, which suddenly stopped being seeds and manure and became things that were sold on capitalist markets. So human life becomes directly annexed to capitalism, and it becomes subject to continuous surveillance in a way that literally threatens the space of human freedom. But we don't have time to explore that, but we can in questions if you want. This sounds really complicated, I'm sure. But at the same time, our relation to data colonialism is also really simple. Because every time we accept an app on our phones, every time we join a digital platform, every time we introduce a smart device into our home, like a smart fridge, every time we do that, we fall back into the spiral of data relations. And usually we do this peacefully. We don't get angry. We don't commit violence. And that leads to a crucial question. Surely you might be asking, how can this be colonialism? Where is the brutal physical violence that we know was a crucial part of historical colonialism? But the reason for this absence of violence is a key point. Think back. Historical colonialism happened when people sailed out from Spain and Portugal to the other side of the world to meet people that they had absolutely no social relations with at all. They were surprised even to find them. As a result, there was only one way of grabbing the gold, which was physical violence or lying, and the colonialists used both. But today's data colonialism is starting at a new point in history, on the basis of 2 previous centuries of all of us getting used to capitalist social relations, which means that just a small adjustment in the legal terms and conditions which govern the operation of our phones can fundamentally change our relation to the flow and the stuff of our lives. No physical violence necessary anymore.
So let's talk more specifically about the coloniality of data relations. Because in the book, what we do is we conduct different transhistorical comparisons, basically using the past to understand the coloniality of data relations in the present. And we organize these comparisons using the same 4X model or game plan found in strategy video games. Those 4 X's are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. That's why it's called a 4X model. And these are the strategies that you're supposed to apply when you play video games, such as the one you see in the background here, which some of you might recognize as part of the Civilization series from Sid Meier. This is actually Colonialism, the video game. And in this game, you can play the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, and the French, I believe. And your role is to colonize the world by applying these 4 strategies: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. Of course, the natives and their lands are non-human players. They are controlled by the computer because they're not even sentient beings. Now, we don't have time to sort of review all of these 4 X's as we do in the book, so we'll just briefly explore 2, explore and exterminate. Let's start with explore. And what I want to do here is compare two historical documents. This first one is quite recent, actually. This is the terms of use that you agree to when you install Google Chrome, the browser from Google. And in case you, like most of us, haven't read these terms of use, here is in part what they say. When you install Google Chrome, quote, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. In other words, just by installing Google Chrome, we surrender all of these rights to Google. Now, I want to compare this document with another much older document. This document was called the requerimiento, or the demand in Spanish, if you translate it, the requirement. And this was a document that was read by Spanish conquistadors as they arrived to the New World and they were about to conquer and pillage a new city, a new village. They would many times arrive under cover of darkness. They would stand outside the limits of the village and proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population that obviously didn't speak Spanish. And the document, the requerimiento, in part read as follows, quote, but if you do not submit to Spanish rule, that is, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of your highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That's the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install there. Now, we're not suggesting that what happened after the Requerimiento was read is the same thing that happens after we install Google Chrome. Fortunately, it isn't. But we are calling attention to this use of misleading and abstract language that nobody understands, that nobody reads, but that we all somehow are assumed to agree to conduct this trick of dispossession, of extraction. Because once we click accept and install, that process unfolds. So that's how exploration is carried out and the acquisition of new terrains, of new domains. How is this happening? Briefly, just want to review our concept of the social quantification sector, because we might ask who is involved in this process of extraction. And so here, Nick and I wanted to come up with a concept to be more specific about who is behind this process. We didn't want to just say internet companies, we didn't want to just say Silicon Valley, so we came up with the example of the social quantification sector as the industry sector devoted to the development of this infrastructure required for extraction. And here, yes, of course, we can encounter the big players, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, as well as their Chinese counterparts, right? Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi. The corporations doing the same thing at a similar scale in China, parts of Asia, and other parts of the world, increasingly, including Africa. The interesting thing about all of these big players is that they are hybrids of monopolies and monopsonies. A monopoly, obviously, you know, it's a single seller. A monopsony in economic terms is a single buyer. So even though we all produce and generate all of this data, there are very few buyers of this data. So those are the monopsonies. And the other point is that there are other players of different sizes, hardware manufacturers, including Samsung, software platforms, social media, as we have been talking about, and as well as corporations dedicated to the analysis or the brokerage of data. So in collection, this is what we call the social quantification sector. But let's get back to our transhistorical comparisons and the 4X model and talk about extermination a little bit. Because as Nick suggested, violence is still part of the equation in data colonialism, at least at two levels. At the symbolic level, I think we can say that even though data colonialism may not actually exterminate life, it does exterminate alternative forms of thinking and alternative forms of being. So colonialism has always been not just about grabbing land and grabbing bodies, but also grabbing minds, changing the way we think about the world. But as we said, physical violence is still very much a part of this new order. Data colonialism continues this legacy of racist, sexist, environmental, and class violence. And just one quick example here is from a recent case in which an algorithm that was used in the United States by hospitals and insurance companies was found out to be racist. And as a consequence of that, millions of Black people in the United States were impacted. Their level of care was determined and suffered in relation to the level of care that white people received, possibly costing real life, the ending of life or people just becoming sick. So that's just one quick example of how this violence can still be very physical.
So we're moving towards the last 5 or 10 minutes of our talk, and we want to end on a more positive note to think about what would it mean to challenge data colonialism? What would it mean to resist it? What would it mean to resist something as large, as all-encompassing as data colonialism? Well, the first point is that since what we're talking about with data colonialism is a social order, as we've said many times, it's a social order, an economic order that we're trying to resist, that we're very much involved in, based on the extraction of data. That means that one-track approaches to resisting just won't work. So it's not enough for particular governments to try and regulate particular platforms, or for individually, for us to say, I'm leaving Facebook. That won't stop the order that goes beyond Facebook. So we have to think more broadly about what would it be to challenge the whole social economic order based around the extraction of data. And at that point, it's very important to recognize that already within the big tech industries, there is some reflection, there is some resistance already developing. So for example, within Google's company DeepMind, there's a scientist called Shakir Mohammed, who with colleagues wrote a piece last year called Decolonial AI, an academic article. So there is some serious reflection there, and that article drew on our book and other books. But we will point out that the conclusion of that article is that we need ethical AI. We need a code for a more ethical AI, which I'm sure is important. The problem is that's not the same as a bigger transformation of the social order. It's just a technical matter only known to the engineers inside Google or other big companies. But we need something much more than just ethical AI. And the third point to bring out is that although some of the challenges we've been emphasizing with data colonialism are really universal, they affect the whole of humanity. They raise questions for the very basis of our human freedom because of the impact of surveillance. At the same time, because we're talking about a continuation of colonialism, of historical colonialism, that there are always special targets for the damage done by data colonialism. Targets of race, class, gender, and of course, indigenous populations continue to suffer and be disadvantaged by the expansion of data colonialism. So data colonialism as a social order reproduces it amounts to a new way of reinforcing those historical forms of oppression and power, which means there are necessarily many fronts for resistance against data colonialism.
What else can we do to decolonize data? Well, we argue that we must also reject this universal rationality of data collection and extraction, this sort of divine mandate that says, whatever Google and Amazon and Facebook do is okay, it's for the benefit of humanity because collecting more data is always a good thing. We must reject the universality of that proposition. We must also, I think, at a cultural, social level, start to reclaim colonized space and time. The space colonized perhaps by surveillance cameras, by digital assistants that are in our kitchens, in our bedrooms, attached to our bodies, collecting all of this intimate data. The colonized time that we spend in front of screens, interacting with these platforms and generating wealth for them. We must reclaim those spaces and times in order to protect the space of the self. And we can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. We also suggest that we must build alliances beyond the academic world and beyond the global north. And this is where we have been trying with colleagues to form networks of support, networks of innovation to do this. So we have a proposal called the Non-Aligned Technology Movement, and another one started by Nick, Paulo Ricarte, and myself called Tierra Común, a network of mostly Latin American scholars looking at how to decolonize data in that context. Here's the website if you want to check it out. The address is tierracomun.net. And just to end, I think one important lesson here is that we must learn from past and present struggles of decolonization, because there are people who have a lot of experience, hundreds of years, in fact, resisting colonialism. Now, their struggles are unique and specific, and we cannot just appropriate them, but we can learn from them, share knowledge, insofar as how to perhaps reappropriate certain forms of technology, to adapt it, adopt it to our ends, how to build new forms of common knowledge that do, in fact, benefit humanity, but not in the way that the universalist discourse tells us, and how to form new kinds of solidarity to support each other. All of this by using a very important tool in the fight against colonialism, and that tool is imagination. Colonialism, as we said, colonizes our ways of thinking, which is why it needs to be resisted with the mind, not just the body. So decolonizing data, we argue, is primarily an exercise in creativity. It's about collectively imagining what new forms of connection or disconnection might look like now and in the future. And with that, I think we will end. And we are very excited to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions. Thank you very much.